Hey friends, today we are tackling one of the most beautiful, infuriating, and deeply American ideas ever written down: freedom of speech. You know, that little line in the First Amendment that's caused more drama than a drag bake-off? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. 10 words, that's all. And yet, those words have launched centuries of lawsuits, talk shows, protests, and, well, comment sections. Welcome to Knowledge is Power, a video series where we are taking a deep look inside the First Amendment and what it says and what it doesn't say. What rights are there, what rights aren't, what rights are protected, and what rights aren't. Hi, I'm Jen, and here's a little background about my personal history with the First Amendment. Imagine a tween at the height of their social and physical awkwardness. Then they were put into a back brace to align the curvature in their spine. Then they found a book where the protagonist was also awkward and in a back brace and learning to navigate all of the horrors of middle school, high school. That tween was me. The book was Deanie by Judy Blume. Now, imagine your school board wanting to censor it and remove it from the bookshelves. My mother said to me, "If you're mad about, do something about it." Those words changed my life. She dragged me into the school board meeting where they were debating removing the book from my school library's bookshelf. I wrote my plea hastily on old construction paper in the car on the way to the meeting. I nervously gave my speech to the school board, ominous adults peering over their notebooks. I had never stood up to authority like that, and I had never been so nervous. Fast forward 40 or so years, do not do the math on that, please, and I'm still not super comfortable being on camera and in the spotlight, in case you couldn't tell. That night, the school board took my plea to heart, and they kept the book on the shelves at schools within my district. What followed was a flurry of nationwide press coverage, an intellectual freedom award from the Illinois Library Association, thanks guys, and even an appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show, where I got to meet the amazing Maya Angelou. Fortunately, the back brace is long gone by that point, and in the 40 years since then, I still haven't shut up about censorship and brandishing my First Amendment rights. And now, the disclaimers. This video does not contain legal advice. You cannot use any of this information to defend your shitty take in court. You will not be able to pass your Con Law 1 exam after this video. What you will have, though, is a little more understanding of how the First Amendment works. When the founders were drafting the Bill of Rights, they weren't sitting around thinking, hey, one day people are gonna tweet conspiracy theories about lizard people in Congress. They were worried about something simpler: power. In 1798, barely a decade after ratifying the Constitution, Congress passed the Sedition Act, making it a crime to criticize the government. Imagine that. The same people who'd just fought a revolution over free expression said, actually, not that much free expression. That tension between the urge to protect speech and the urge to control it has been the beating heart of the First Amendment ever since. Why should freedom of speech be a fundamental right? Now, let's get philosophical for a second. Why protect speech at all, especially the awful, false, or offensive kind? In a democracy, the people are supposed to be in charge. But how can you govern yourself if you're not allowed to criticize your leaders? Free speech isn't just a right. It's the operating system of democracy. Without it, the whole thing crashes. Now, this one comes to us from John Stuart Mill, who basically said, if you silence an opinion, you might be silencing the truth. The idea is that truth comes out in a clash of ideas, messy, loud, occasionally meme-filled debate. Even when people are wrong, hearing them out helps us sharpen our understanding. Think of it as democracy's group chat, loud, unfiltered, and occasionally unbearable, but necessary. Freedom of speech isn't just about politics. It's about being able to express who you are. Whether that's wearing a protest shirt, writing a song, or making a TikTok rant about student loans, it's the right way to say, this is me, without the government stepping in and saying, actually, no, you're canceled. Here's the weird paradox. Protecting offensive speech actually helps build a tolerant society. Because if the government can silence speech that you don't like today, it can silence speech you need tomorrow. We have to tolerate the intolerant, not because we agree, but because the alternative is so much worse. Now, fast forward to today, when the battlefield isn't just newspapers and soapboxes, it's social media. Your right to speak is still protected from government censorship, sure. But what about when your YouTube video gets demonetized? Or Jimmy Kimmel gets suspended because of the FCC threatened some media corporations with federal bullying? Or when Charlie Kirk was assassinated immediately after stating some really racist and really transphobic remarks? What about the right of Americans to gather to protest the current administration, as we saw last weekend with the No Kings rallies? Here's the thing. The First Amendment limits government, not private platforms or talk show hosts. That's why Jimmy Kimmel was reinstated so quickly. The FCC overstepped their boundaries allowed within the First Amendment, and you all canceled your Disney Plus and Hulu subscriptions to let the government know that you would not stand for free speech being chilled. It's why over 7 million of you marched last weekend to protest. But the fact that people feel like free speech is under siege tells us something real. Our national conversation about free speech has expanded way beyond the legal text. It's become a cultural value, a brand, even a weapon in the content wars. And that's where the Supreme Court keeps getting pulled back in. Because every generation brings new technology, new tensions, and new reasons for someone to say, wait, can they really do that? So before we dive into the legal maze, content-based laws, prior restraints, and all the juicy constitutional drama, remember this. The First Amendment was never meant to make speech comfortable. It was meant to make it possible. So now that we've decided why free speech matters, let's talk about how the courts figure out when the government has gone too far. Spoiler, it's complicated. Like Facebook relationship status complicated. When a law limits speech, judges pull out a kind of constitutional toolbox. And the first question is this law content-based or content-neutral? Because if the law cares what you're saying, it's in big trouble. So a content-based law is basically the government saying, you can talk about puppies, but not about politics. Or, you can criticize everyone except us. That's when the courts apply strict scrutiny, the toughest kind of test in constitutional law. Now, if you'll remember from last week, we covered strict scrutiny under freedom of religion and the Free Exercise Clause, especially as it came about in Employment Division versus Smith and RFRA. Basically, strict scrutiny says the government has to provide a compelling reason for that law to exist, and the law is narrowly tailored to the purpose, meaning it doesn't accidentally squash a bunch of innocent speech along the way. Now, a content-neutral law, on the other hand, doesn't care what you say, only how, when, or where you say it. Think of it like noise permits at a park, or parade permits that apply to everyone. Late-night noise ordinances that mean that every outdoor concert ends at 11, or before. Those get much easier intermediate scrutiny treatment. So let's now hop into the time machine. In Turner Broadcasting versus the FCC in 1994, cable companies argued that Congress was unfairly forcing them to carry local channels, a speech restriction. The court said, chill, man. This isn't about your message, it's about your infrastructure. That became content neutral. and is very much in line with what we saw happen with Sinclair and Nexstar stations not wanting to carry Jimmy Kimmel a couple weeks ago. Now contrast that with Booz versus Berry, which happened in 1988, when DC banned displaying signs critical of foreign governments near embassies. The court said, that's literally regulating content. Unconstitutional. And in Simon & Schuster versus New York State Crime Victims Board, a case that came about in 1991, the state tried to seize profits from criminals who sold books about their crimes. Basically, Son of Sam laws. The court said, nope, you can't single out crime stories just because you don't like the topic. Sometimes, though, the line between content-based and content-neutral laws gets about as fuzzy as Reddit's comments rules. In City of Renton versus Playtime Theaters, a case that came about in 1986, the court said that cities could zone adult theaters away from schools, calling it content-neutral because the purpose wasn't the message, but instead the secondary effects, like crime and property values. Critics call that legal gymnastics, and honestly, they're not wrong. Then came along National Endowment for the Arts versus Finley, a case that came about in 1998, where Congress said that NEA had to consider decency and respect when awarding arts grants. The NEA had awarded a grant to Piss Christ, a depiction of a crucifix covered in human urine. The court upheld it, saying that it was not outright censorship, more like guidance, because nothing says creative freedom like a government decency checklist. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, where technology turned everyone into a potential broadcaster. Social media rose, and everybody had their own platform. Suddenly, questions about content regulation aren't just about newspapers and art galleries. They're about algorithms and platform moderation. Take Reed versus Town of Gilbert, a sleepy Arizona case about church signs that became a modern free speech landmark. This case happened in 2015. The town had different rules for political, ideological, and directional signs. The court said, if you need to read the sign to enforce the rule, it's content-based. Insert an unconstitutional mic drop. That decision supercharged free speech law in the digital age. Suddenly, courts were applying strict scrutiny to all kinds of modern regulations, from panhandling ordinances to city mural rules. And in 2023's Counterman versus Colorado, the court wrestled with when online threats cross the line from protected speech to criminal harassment. They ruled that prosecutors must prove the speaker was reckless about whether their words would be taken as threats, not just as somebody felt threatened. That's a big deal in the age of DMs, live streams, and unfiltered comment sections. Next, two of my favorite legal buzzwords sound like bad Yelp reviews: vagueness and overbreadth. A law is vague when people can't tell what's illegal, like don't be annoying ordinances. That was the problem in Coates versus Cincinnati, a case from 1971, when the city literally banned people from assembling in an annoying manner. The court struck it down because, honestly, have you met people? A law is overbroad when it punishes too much innocent speech along with the bad. In Shad versus Borough of Mount Ephraim, a case from 1981, a town tried to ban all live entertainment to stop adult shows. The court said, you can't kill the theater to stop the strip club. And in Board of Airport Commissioners versus Jews for Jesus, a case that happened in 1987, LAX banned all First Amendment activities. Blanket. The court didn't even need a hearing. It was so overbroad, it basically broke the concept of free speech. Now we're seeing the same principles play out online. Platforms write vague community guidelines that change every 5 minutes, and politicians on both sides accuse social media companies of overbreadth. In Murphy versus Missouri, a case from 2024, huge case, the Supreme Court just ruled on whether government officials violated the First Amendment by pressuring platforms to remove misinformation. The court sidestepped the broad claims, but signaled that government jawboning or informal pressure to censor could cross constitutional lines. That's the 21st century equivalent of, you can't arrest me for my sign, but stop calling my boss about it. We saw this earlier this year when the FCC pressured media corporations to stop carrying Jimmy Kimmel Live, a late-night talk show. This one didn't even have to go before the Supreme Court. You all voted with your wallets and cost Kimmel's parent company nearly $4 billion in cancellations. That also broke the internet. We're also seeing this play out with Trump's incessant posting of AI-generated videos, like when he wore a crown and flew a fighter jet and sprayed thousands of people attending the No Kings rallies with feces. The big idea here? The First Amendment does not protect you from criticism, cancellation, or YouTube algorithm. It protects you from the government picking winners and losers in the marketplace of ideas. And as we'll see next, when the government does try and silence someone, the court looks very closely at how it does it, especially when that silence happens before the speech ever even hits the air. Let's talk about one of the most feared phrases in free speech law: prior restraint. It sounds like something you'd learn in therapy, but in constitutional law, it means the government stopped speech before it happens. And the Supreme Court hates that. Like, I caught you cheating on the Bill of Rights, hates it. So what is prior restraint? A prior restraint is when officials say, you can't publish that, instead of punishing you after you do. Imagine the government taking your video down before you even upload it. It's the ultimate censorship power, and history shows that it's dangerous. Back in Neer versus Minnesota, a case from 1931, a small newspaper was exposing local corruption, and the state tried to shut it down as a public nuisance. The Supreme Court said, nope, the press has to be free to offend first and deal with the consequences later. That decision became the backbone of American press freedom, which we'll go further into next week. Now, are prior restraints really all that bad? Yes, and the court has receipts. When the Nixon administration tried to block the New York Times and Washington Post from publishing the Pentagon Papers, claiming national security risks, the court in New York Times Co. versus United States in 1971 famously said that the word security is a broad, vague generality. Translation, you can't just yell national security every time a truth makes you uncomfortable. Then in Nebraska Press Association versus Stewart, a case that happened a few years later in 1976, a judge banned journalists from reporting details of a murder trial to protect the defendant's fair trial rights. The court struck it down, again saying basically, nice try, but you can't gag the press to avoid a messy jury pool. And for the sequel that nobody asked for, Alexander versus United States in 1993, when the Fed seized a business's assets after an obscenity conviction. The court said that's not a prior restraint if it's punishment for past conduct, not a ban on future speech. So yeah, the line is thin, but it's there, or at least it was prior to the January 6th insurrection. And then there's licensing, when the government says you need permission to speak. Historically, that was how kings censored pamphleteers. Today, it's how cities sometimes censor protest. In Lovell versus City of Griffin, a case that came about in 1938, a Jehovah's Witness was arrested for handing out religious leaflets without a permit. The court said, nope, you don't need a hall pass to talk about your faith. Modern versions include parade permits, street art licensing, or film classifications. Sometimes those are fine, but only when the standards are crystal clear and officials have almost zero discretion, as in City of Lakewood versus Plain Dealer Publishing, a case that happened in 1988. The court warned that giving a mayor unbridled discretion to approve or deny permits invites censorship, because power plus personal taste equals danger zone. So the court insists that any system of prior approval must have strict procedural safeguards, quick appeals, clear rules, and no, we'll get back to you whenever vibes. Without those, your permit process becomes just another way to say, shut up. So what counts as infringement on free speech? Not every limit on expression is a ban. Sometimes it's a little sneakier, like financial punishment, compelled speech, or conditional funding. In United States versus National Treasury Employees Union, a case that happened in 1995, the government banned federal workers from accepting honoraria for speeches. The court said that unfairly punished them for speaking publicly, a First Amendment violation, with the side of, who needs that much bureaucracy anyway? So compelled speech is, you can't make me say that. We often think of free speech as the right to talk, but it's also the right not to. In West Virginia's State Board of Education versus Barnett, a case that happened back in 1943, the court upheld that students could not be forced to salute the flag. Justice Jackson delivered one of the most powerful lines in constitutional history. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official can prescribe what shall be orthodox. Mic drop. Later, in McIntyre versus Ohio Elections Commission in 1995, the court protected anonymous political leafleting, basically proto-Twitter anonymity. And in Buckley versus American Constitutional Law Foundation in 1999, it said Colorado could not force petition circulators to wear ID badges, because sometimes anonymity is the message. And then sometimes the government says, we're not banning your speech, we're just not paying you unless you say what we like. That is called unconstitutional condition. In Speezer versus Randall in 1958, California denied tax exemptions to veterans who would not sign loyalty oaths. The court said, you can't make patriotism pay to play. We could see this come back with the current loyalty oaths that the Department of Defense is requiring media outlets to adhere to. Last week, many of them banded together, including the Secretary of Defense's former employer, to refuse to sign this oath of loyalty when reporting to the DoD, or about the DoD. We'll probably get more into the loyalty oaths required at the DoD next week, as that is a significant infringement upon the press. And in Rust versus Sullivan in 1991, the government funded family planning clinics but barred them from discussing abortion. The court reluctantly said that this was okay because the government was the speaker, not the censor. But that ruling remains deeply controversial, as is pretty much anything when it comes to family planning. Fast forward to today, where we're seeing modern Rust movements in debates over government pressure on platforms, funding for schools with speech restrictions, and even state-level anti-boycott laws. It's the same tug of war. Money and message locked in a centuries-old dance. Here's the thing. You don't need to throw someone in jail to chill their speech. A denied grant, a revoked permit, a pulled endorsement, a book removed from a school bookshelf. It all adds up. In the digital age, power doesn't always silence you directly. Sometimes it just tweaks the algorithm. The First Amendment isn't about guaranteeing you a platform. It's about making sure the government doesn't get to decide who deserves one. Now that we've talked about how far speech can go, let's talk about where it can't go. Because yes, there are limits. You can't threaten people, commit fraud, or stream the Last of Us finale before it airs. The last one's copyright, but still. The Supreme Court has spent a century figuring out when dangerous, hateful, or explicit speech stops being protected expression and becomes punishable conduct. And spoiler, the line keeps moving. Let's start with incitement. Speech that pushes people towards violence or lawbreaking. You've probably heard the famous phrase, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. That comes to us from Schenck versus United States, a case back in 1919, when Charles Schenck was convicted for distributing anti-draft leaflets during World War I. Justifier Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that speech can be punished if it creates a clear and present danger of causing substantive harm. Which sounds reasonable, until you realize that clear and present danger was soon used to justify jailing people just for criticizing the government. In Gitlow versus New York in 1925 and Whitney versus California in 1927, states used that test to go after socialists and communists. The court basically said, even if you're not violent now, your rights might be dangerous later. So yeah, free speech was not having a great century so far. Then came Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, a Klan rally case that flipped the entire script. Clarence Brandenburg gave a speech about revenge against the government. Instead of punishing him, the court drew a new, tighter line. Speech can only be punished if it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to produce such action. That's it. Mere advocacy of violence or unpopular ideas, protected. Actual immediate incitement, not protected. So when people debate whether certain political speeches or online posts incited violence, the question is always, was it mere outrage or a real call to immediate illegal action? And I think we really need to take a closer look at that about January 6th cases. It's why most of the speech around the January 6th attack, for example, walks that tricky line. Morally questionable, but often legally protected. Next up, the category that sounds cool in theory, but rarely survives in practice: fighting words. In Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire in 1942, a Jehovah's Witness called a city marshal a damned fascist. The court said that the words, by their very utterance, inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace, aren't protected. But in the decades since, that doctrine has been narrowed so hard it's basically on life support. And in today's authoritarian hellscape, the plug has nearly been pulled. Cases like Gooding versus Wilson in 1972 and RAV versus City of St. Paul in 1992 made it clear that fighting words laws cannot be vague or content-based. In RAV, a local teenager burned a cross on a black family's lawn. Awful. But the court struck down the hate speech ordinance because it punished only certain types of offensive messages. Justice Scalia basically said, again, if you want my opinion on him, go back and watch previous videos about this. You can't ban speech just because it's racist. You can ban it because it's a threat or harassment, but not just for being hateful. That distinction is what drives a lot of modern frustration. In America, hate speech by itself is protected, unless it crosses into true threats, targeted harassment, or incitement. It's speech the government cannot punish. And now we enter the swamp: obscenity. The court has spent decades trying and failing to define what counts as obscene. In Roth versus United States in 1957, it said obscenity was not protected because it lacked redeeming social importance. Then in Miller versus California in 1973, the court gave us the now infamous Miller test. Speech is obscene if the average person applying community standards finds it appeals to prurient interest. 2, it depicts sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. And 3, it lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. It's the legal equivalent of, I'll know it when I see it. And that's actually from Jacobellis versus Ohio by Justice Potter Stewart in 1964. And yes, that line is still quoted in constitutional law classes and bad Tinder bios. Which brings me to wonder, can a court compel the release of the Epstein files? Child pornography, however, is not protected. Period. End of story. The court made that crystal clear in New York versus Ferber in 1982, because the harm to children occurs in the making of the material itself. As for low-value sexual expression, like nude dancing or adult entertainment, it's protected, but subject to zoning and regulation. See City of Erie versus Paps AM in 2000, where the court upheld a public nudity ban as a regulation of conduct, not expression. So yeah, Free speech protects a lot, but not everything that happens on a pole. One of my favorite free speech cases ever comes to us in Cohen versus California back in 1971. Dude walks into a courthouse wearing a jacket that says, "The draft." And the court said, one man's vulgarity is another's lyric. Protected. End of story. But when it comes to broadcast media, the rules get a little bit messier. In FCC versus Pacifica Foundation in 1978, George Carlin's 7 dirty words routine led the court to uphold restrictions on indecent language over public airwaves. Basically, the court said, you can say it, but maybe not at 2 p.m. on FM radio. That tension continues today on TV, streaming, and social media, where we're still arguing over what counts as indecent and who gets to decide. When the internet showed up, the court had to decide several things. Do we treat online speech like print with full protection, or broadcast, where it's regulated? In Reno versus ACLU in 1997, the court struck down the Communications Decency Act, calling the internet the most participatory form of mass speech yet developed. Full First Amendment protection. Later, United States versus Playboy Entertainment Group in 2000 reinforced that even adult cable content couldn't be broadly restricted, only targeted with the least restrictive means. So whether it's OnlyFans, or political live streams, or even a Turning Point USA rally, the principle still stands. The government can't just turn off the Wi-Fi when it gets uncomfortable. If there is one takeaway here, it's this. The First Amendment protects speech not because it is safe, but because it is dangerous. Because sometimes the only way to test our values is to let the worst voices speak and see if better ones can answer. It's messy, it's maddening, and it is exactly what the founders signed us up for. Okay, deep breath. Because this is where the First Amendment meets the 21st century, and they do not get along. Let's start with a question that sounds like it belongs in an ethics seminar. If money talks, does that mean billionaires never shut up? In Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that spending money to influence elections is a form of speech. That was the opening act. Then, Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission in 2010 turned that amp up to 11. The court held that corporations and unions have a First Amendment right to spend unlimited money on independent political ads, as long as they don't coordinate directly with candidates. Justice Kennedy's majority opinion basically said, the government cannot decide who gets to speak, even if they're rich. Justice Stevens' dissent was more like, cool, but now we've handed a megaphone to whoever can buy the most airtime. Cue the rise of super PACs, dark money, and election ads that look like they were written by feverish raccoons at 3 a.m. If you've ever watched a political ad and thought, who paid for that? The answer is probably someone very wealthy exercising free speech. So fast forward to the age of social media, where everyone has a platform, but the platforms have the power. The big question is, do Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, or X have a First Amendment duty to host all speech? Short answer is nope. The First Amendment restricts government censorship, not private censorship. But that hasn't stopped the lawsuits. In Manhattan Community Access versus Halleck in 2019, the court held that a private operator of a public access TV channel was not a state actor, meaning, again, private platforms can moderate however they want. That principle carried into cases like NetChoice versus Paxton and Moody versus NetChoice, still evolving this year currently, where states like Texas and Florida have passed laws trying to force platforms to carry political speech that they might otherwise moderate. The lower court split, and the Supreme Court is still wrestling with it. Should tech platforms be treated like publishers with editorial freedom, or like common carriers, required to treat all users equally? If you think that sounds messy, congratulations, you understand internet law. Here's where the free speech debate leaves the courtroom and enters the timeline. On one side, you got people like Charlie Kirk and Elon Musk claiming that big tech and the establishment are silencing conservative voices. On the other hand, folks like Jimmy Kimmel and other mainstream hosts sometimes joke or rage about speech that crosses the line of decency, truth, or taste. Both sides invoke free speech, but they're talking about very different things. Kirk means platform access, who gets to speak online. Kimmel means social responsibility, how speech shapes what we consider acceptable in public life. The kicker? Neither of those are First Amendment issues, not directly. They're cultural fights over the values behind free speech, not the legal fight itself. But these cultural moments matter because they shift the way ordinary people think about speech. When celebrities or influencers are deplatformed, canceled, or sometimes when comedians face backlash, the public reaction becomes part of our evolving free speech ecosystem, even if the Constitution never enters the chat. Is algorithmic amplification the new censorship? Now, here's a question that Madison and Jefferson definitely didn't see coming. What happens when algorithms, not governments, decide who gets heard? If your post vanishes into the algorithmic abyss, was it censored or just uninteresting? Platforms claim neutrality, but recommendation systems shape the discourse in ways that the founders couldn't imagine. That's why cases like Gonzalez versus Google in 2023 tested whether platforms could be held liable for promoting extremist content through the algorithm. The court ultimately sidestepped the issue, leaving Section 230, the law shielding platforms from most user content liability, intact for now. So, for better or worse, the algorithmic Wild West rolls on. For example, in the creator ecosystem that I live in, we're taught that, you need to make more interesting content in order to succeed on Instagram. But Instagram is currently throttling all engagement and reach. So a lot of us people who are posting about our businesses on Instagram are kind of lost. We don't know what to do. Nobody's seeing our posts right now. Algorithmic Wild West, still intact. Of course, the First Amendment does apply if the government pressures platforms to remove speech. Enter Murphy versus Missouri in 2024, one of the biggest recent free speech showdowns. Several states and individuals claimed that the federal government had coerced social media platforms into suppressing posts about COVID-19 and elections. The court held that not all government communication with platforms equals coercion. Officials can urge or encourage, but they can't threaten or compel removal. That distinction between persuasion and pressure is the frontier of free speech law in the digital age. And we're about to get challenged even further with Larry Ellison's purchase of TikTok. Larry Ellison is a close friend of Trump and supports right-wing interests at a large, very large amount. He's like the second, third, fourth most richest person in the world right now. So with that knowledge, will TikTok start to push the conservative agenda, as it's currently, or has more recently been a hive for, a little bit more progressive thought content? Are we about to see, or are we already seeing, suppression of contrary views on platforms owned by people with political interests and access to the president? We'll see. So money is still talking, and loudly. After Citizens United, of course, which like a case which nobody likes, McCutcheon versus the FEC in 2014 struck down limits on aggregate campaign contributions, further expanding donors' influence. Critics call it legalized oligarchy. That was over 10 years ago. Defenders called it participatory democracy. I call it the most expensive argument about the First Amendment in history. But the court's logic remains consistent. If spending money communicates a political message, then limits on spending restrict speech. It's a bold stance, one that treats billionaires and broke activists as equals in principle, if not in volume. So, here we are. In a world where you can say almost anything online, platforms can delete almost anything you post, and the government can't do much about either. But billionaires can buy louder megaphones than everyone else combined. Is that freedom? Or just freedom for the few? That's the paradox we live in. The First Amendment still prevents government from silencing you, but it doesn't guarantee that anyone will listen. Free speech used to mean shouting in the town square. Now it means hoping the algorithm favors you, that the advertiser doesn't pull out, and that your platform doesn't change the rules mid-thread. It's messy, it's unequal, and yet it's still ours. Because even if the marketplace of ideas still looks more like a chaotic flea market, it's the one place where every voice still has a shot, even if the rent is too damn high. Is this what free speech was meant to be? Let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard someone say, "It's a free country, I can say what I want," and thought, yes, but do you actually understand what that means? Because here's the thing, most people don't. We treat free speech like it's Wi-Fi. Always on, always free, and usually abused by someone blasting bad opinions in public. But it's not a default setting. It's a deliberate act of faith, a gamble that more speech, not less, will make us stronger. Back when the court and scholars tried to explain why we protect speech so fiercely, they gave us 4 big ideas, the philosophical spine of the First Amendment. Self-governance. We protect speech because democracy does not work without it. As Justice Brandeis wrote in Whitney versus California back in 1927, the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones. Translation, you can't govern yourself if you can't talk about how you're governed. That's why even today, when politicians try to label inconvenient truths as misinformation, we push back. The founders didn't want a comfortable democracy. They wanted an informed one. 2, the discovery of truth. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes gave us the marketplace of ideas, the belief that truth wins in open competition. Now, yes, this marketplace has turned into something between Facebook Marketplace and a Reddit thread, but the principle still matters. Censorship assumes the censor knows best. Free speech assumes that we, flawed, emotional, cat meme-loving humans, will eventually sort it out. Even in chaos, truth finds ways to surface. It might just have to fight through a few conspiracy theories and cat videos to get there. 3, autonomy. Free speech is about the right to be you. To stand up, speak out, or stay silent if that's your choice. That's what West Virginia versus Barnett back in 1943 was all about. The right of students not to salute the flag. Justice Jackson wrote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion." It's why we can choose our words, our art, our humor, and even our silence, because the First Amendment protects your voice from becoming someone else's slogan. And finally, number 4, the hardest one, tolerance. We protect speech not because we like what people say, but because we fear the alternative. It's easy to defend speech you agree with. It's hard to defend speech that makes your skin crawl. But when we stop tolerating uncomfortable speech, the government gets to decide what uncomfortable means. And spoiler, it usually means you. Justice Kennedy put it best in Texas versus Johnson in 1989, the flag burning case. If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds that idea offensive or disagreeable. That's the core of it. The courage to let others speak, even if we'd rather they didn't. And this is coming back to the surface today with Trump issuing an executive order punishing people who burn the flag, saying that they'll find some way to put you in prison for a year for it. Today, free speech does not just live in the courtroom. It lives in the feed. It's shaped by influencers, algorithms, and outrage cycles that refresh every 6 hours, if not sooner. But the stakes haven't changed. Every generation faces its own temptation to silence what scares it. For the founders, it was seditious libel. For the Cold War, it was communism. For us, it's misinformation, extremism, and the chaos of a billion microphones. The details change, but the question does not. Do we trust people to think freely or not? Here's the funny thing. The internet has made us louder, but not necessarily freer. We've democratized speech, but we have also gamified outrage. The algorithm rewards fury, not thought. But that doesn't mean that the First Amendment is obsolete. It means that it's more relevant today than ever. Because the right to speak freely isn't about making sure that everyone is right. It's about making sure that everyone gets the chance. Free speech is not a settled principle. It's an experiment. Every generation gets to rerun it, and the data is always messy. We've learned that words can wound. We've learned that lies can spread faster than facts. But we've also learned that censorship can do something even worse. It can make people stop thinking for themselves. And that, at the end of the day, is what the First Amendment is guarding against. It's not just about speech. It's about conscience. So, is free speech dangerous? Absolutely. But it's also beautiful. It's a safety valve of democracy, the laboratory of truth, the mirror of our best and worst selves. It's why comedians can mock kings, journalists can grill presidents, and ordinary people can shout at the powerful, or at least tweet about them. Yes, it's messy. It always has been. But as Justice Brandeis reminded us almost a century ago, those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. So when you hear someone say, "I have the right to free speech," remember, they're not just quoting the Constitution. They're invoking one of the boldest, riskiest, and most human ideas ever written down. That truth, justice, and democracy don't need protection from speech. They need speech to survive. And that's it. That's our tour through the wild, messy, and magnificent world of free speech. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived a brief overview in the most powerful and most misunderstood sentence in American law. Next week, we're turning the page to freedom of the press, where we'll ask, can journalists still hold power to account in the age of clickbait, leaks, and billionaire-controlled media? Can a meme be the press? And what happens when the truth itself has a PR problem? If you want to keep this constitutional conversation rolling, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that little bell. Because hey, it's free speech and free notifications. Lucky you! I've been Jen, and remember, the First Amendment isn't just ink on parchment. It's a dare to speak, to listen, and to think freely. Until next time, every accusation is a confession. Free Palestine. And remember, we still have not seen the full Epstein files yet.